Welcome to World History. Since we've got the African part of the trading network out of the way, we're going to fully move into the Atlantic world by talking today about European exploration and the phenomenon known as the Columbian Exchange, which is one of the most important processes in all of world history. So, here are your objectives for today: is explain why Europeans, including Columbus, went on voyages of exploration. And you're going to analyze the effect of the connections between the American continents, Europe, and Africa. So, why did Europeans start exploring during this time period? Well, the first step is something called the Reconquista, which is the reconquest, quote unquote, of the Iberian Peninsula, here the two states of Portugal and Spain, from the Muslim kingdoms that had controlled it since pretty much the conquests of Muhammad. These Christian kingdoms recaptured territory gradually from the Muslims and created the first two modern countries of Spain and Portugal. By modern countries, we mean a king controlling directly a significant amount of territory here. So, with these two modern countries developing in these areas, these kings and queens had significant power, and the fact that they had had connections with the Muslim world meant they had access to all of these new technologies that were developed from the communication and the technology sharing between Europeans and Muslims. So all of these new things, including the caravel, which is a new sturdier ship that can travel more safely on the oceans, the lateen sail, these triangular sails which allow you to travel better against the wind, and then new navigational techniques, kicked off basically a race between the Spanish and Portuguese to try to find new trade routes, specifically to Asia, in order to get access to tea and spices and the other valuable trade goods that we talked about in our Asia unit. As we just mentioned, Spain and Portugal were in this competition to try to get access specifically to trade goods from India and China in the Indian Ocean. Portugal had a lead in this because they had, first, Prince Henry the Navigator, who set up a school for navigation to help train explorers like Bartholomew Diaz, who was the first European to travel around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa here. The Portuguese would get all the way to India, therefore bypassing the Ottoman Empire and having a direct route to get the spices that they wanted so badly. The Spanish, meanwhile, went another route. Hopefully you're familiar with the story of Christopher Columbus and how he first went to the King of Portugal and was denied any sort of support, and then went to Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain, and they were convinced him, and he convinced them to give him 3 ships. He then took these 3 ships on 4 voyages to the Caribbean and to South America, thereby setting up Spanish claims to this territory. And he, of course, made first contact with Native Americans, as we can see over here. Columbus is incredibly important because he created although he was not the first European to come to the North and South American continents, he did establish the first lasting contact between these two areas, which is going to lead to the transfer of a lot of different crops, animals, plants, and diseases between the two sort of hemispheres. Although this process was beneficial for Europeans, it was absolutely devastating for Native Americans. Specifically, diseases like smallpox killed huge numbers of Native Americans, and the depopulation led to the collapse of societies, and then the Spanish came in and conquered many of the great empires and Native American tribes and groups in the Americas. And so this event is referred to as the Great Dying, and we don't have specific numbers of how many Native Americans died, but in Mexico alone, it's estimated that somewhere in the area of 20 million Native Americans died, and the number is probably closer to the hundreds of millions if you talk about both continents. So the effect of specifically disease on Native Americans was just unbelievably massive. What Columbus is most well known for is the Columbian Exchange, which is the exchange of plants and animals between the two continents. We're going to look at this much more in depth in class, but just take a moment to look at some of the crops that went in both of these directions. For example, tomatoes and potatoes coming to the Eurasian continents and to Africa were all incredibly important. And the livestock coming to the New World was incredibly important and transformed the lives of Native Americans across the continents, as did, as we mentioned before, the disease, which had an incredibly negative effect on Native American societies. There are a bunch more explorers that we could talk about, and we will spend a little bit of time in class talking about them. But the last person you need to know is Ferdinand Magellan, who is noteworthy because he sailed for Spain and he both discovered a path around South America and made it all the way to the Philippines, where he was then killed, as we see here, after trying to brutally convert the natives to Christianity. But after his death, his crew managed to finish the rest of the voyage, and one ship with only a few survivors on it limped back to Spain. But his crew gets the distinction of being the first people to circumnavigate the world. That brings us back to our objectives for the day. Make sure you can provide some detail in your answers to these two, and we'll come back in class to emphasize the most important parts of this lesson.